Well, 2020 didn't exactly turn out the way we thought it was going to turn out. I mean, a year named 2020, we talk about 2020 hindsight, 2020 vision, and it's all like good ideas, right? Well, that's not really the way it turned out. Now we're staring down the barrel of a new year and we're approaching it with optimism, hoping this new year is going to be better, right? But I want to talk to you today about giants. The obstacles that get in our way, the stuff that looks like it's going to take us out. How can we slay? How can we conquer the giants that we face?
The world, but it couldn't fill me. That empty place and treasures that fade are never enough. And you came along and put me back together. It's not satisfied here in your love. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing is better than you. Afraid to show you my weakness, my failures and flaws. Lord, you've seen them all, and you still call me friend. 'Cause the God of the mountain is the God of the valley. Place, your mercy and grace won't find me again. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing is better than your love. There's nothing, Lord. Oh, better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing is better than you. You turn mourning to dancing. You give beauty for ashes. You turn shame into glory. You're the only one who cares. You turn mourning to dancing. You give beauty for ashes. You turn shame into glory. You're the only one who. You turn grace into gardens. You turn grace into gardens. You turn bones into armies. You turn seas into turn lawns into armies. You turn cities into highways. You're the only one who cares. You're the only one. You're the only one who cares. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing. Nothing is better than you. Oh.
There's a classic story in the Older Testament. I'd call it a great hit from God's older, early years, and it involves a young man named David, and the name of David's giant was Goliath. Goliath was a seemingly insurmountable obstacle. He was an enemy, and the name of this giant put fear in the people. And I want you to think just for a second, though. David's giant was Goliath. What's your giant? What's the name of that insurmountable obstacle that seems to be getting in the way, that stands in your way, that enemy that's out there, maybe that looks like it's going to take you down? You know your giant. You recognize his walk. You hear the thunder of his voice, that giant. You know the one. And the bills maybe that you can't pay, that taunts you late at night, that habit that you just can't seem to ever lick and break. And that giant is the stuff that is quick to point out your inadequacies and your fears, the failures that you can't forget, the future that you're afraid maybe to face. And David faced a Philistine, a guy named Goliath. What giant are you facing? What are you dealing with? And this story I want to tell you today is a great and helpful story. And I want to show you how David dealt with his giant, how he slayed it. And maybe this classic from the Older Testament, from God's early years, can find a way, maybe from that we can find a way to kick the tar out of our giant as well. Well, here's the background. Now, David's showdown happened during one of the many confrontations and battles that occurred between Israel and the Philistines during the reign of King Saul. The showdown happened shortly after the last judge of Israel, a guy named Samuel, had lived, and he declared that Saul's kingship over Israel would be replaced by the ascension of this young man named David. He would come to the throne. And so God was going to establish David as the king. And in this classic story, we'll see that David actually does possess the courage. He possesses the determination. He possesses even the military experience to fulfill the role and to be a good leader, to do a good job in his destiny. As such, this story becomes kind of a defining moment, both in the life of David and in the nation of Israel. And it correctly, if correctly applied, I think it also can become a defining moment in our experience. This story has the potential of becoming a defining moment for you and for me as well. The example of determination and determined and courageous faith is in the story, and in the midst of insurmountable, gigantic problems, okay? The lessons of the story are an enduring classic, really. Now, the main problem with giants, okay, is that they seem so big and so scary, right? Giants create a can't-do kind of attitude, and Goliath created a can't-do attitude for the whole army of Israel, for the king, for the guys that were, slinging the hash in the mess tent. Everybody was saying, we can't do this. We can't get past this big, scary giant. Now, the story tells us, it's in 1 Samuel 17, and it tells us just how big and scary Goliath was and why a can't-do attitude gripped them all. It says this. Now, the Philistines gathered their forces for war, and they assembled at a place called Succoth in Judea, and they pitched a camp there. And Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. And the Philistines occupied one hill, the Israelites were on the other hill, and the valley was the place they were going to fight, the valley between them. So what follows next is a physical description of the giant they were facing. It's rare for biblical accounts to give such a detailed physical description of somebody, but it's important for us to understand why these people were just so scared spitless, okay? It says this in verse 4, a champion named Goliath, and this is important, was from Gath. A town called Gath was his hometown. He came out of the Philistine camp, and it says that he was over 9 feet tall. Okay, this is a ginormous guy, okay? And he had a bronze helmet on his head, and he wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels, which is like 125 pounds. So his armor and his helmet is 125 pounds. This is a big, strong guy, formidable, okay? On his legs, he wore these bronze, like shin guard type things, and he had a bronze javelin slung on his back, and his spear shaft, it says, weighed 15 pounds, okay, just his spear shaft alone. And his shield bearer, think of a shield bearer as kind of like a caddy you bring along for the battle, carries some of your extra stuff. Well, his caddy was carrying his shield, and he went ahead of him. And Goliath was clearly, he'd gotten inside the heads of the Israelites. So the Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why don't you come out and fight me? Why, when you line up for battle, why don't you come on out? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down and do battle with me. If he is able to fight and kill me," so he's making a proposition to him, "he will become your subjects, and if I become overcome and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." So Goliath is presenting an option to this battle, okay? It's called representative combat. And he's saying, in effect, why should so many have to die, okay? Let's just have a mano-a-mano battle, okay? A battle of champions, and win or take all. One side will become the slaves of the others, but at least they get to live, right? And so Goliath was taunting them, and giants are really good at taunting us, I think. And this Philistine said, then the Philistine Goliath said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man, and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were just trembling. They were dismayed. They were terrified. He's inside their heads. And now entered David into the storyline. Few knew it at the time, but he was the God-ordained heir to the throne. And this was going to become a defining moment, not only for him, but for the whole nation. Verse 12 says, "Now David, who was from Bethlehem in Judea, he was the son of Jesse." And oh, by the way, Jesse, it says, had 8 sons, and in Saul's time, he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab. The second was Abinadab. You don't hear these names very often anymore. And the third was Shammah, okay? And David was the youngest, okay? The 3 oldest went to battle full time, okay? So they followed Saul out to the battlefield. But David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. So David was kind of a part-time warrior in this thing, or he'd show up at part-time. Verse 16 says, "For 40 days, the Philistine," they're speaking of Goliath, "came forward every morning and evening and took his stand." Come on, guys, let's do this. Now Jesse said to his son David, so they're back home, and David's with his dad Jesse. He says, "Hey, take this. I got 16 pounds of roasted grain to take to the guys, okay? And I got 10 loaves of bread for your brothers. Go take all this stuff to the camp, and take along 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit as well, and see how your brothers are, and bring back some message. Give me a report on how they're doing." There was Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines. It says, "Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd and loaded up and set out as his dad, Jesse, had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to their battle positions, shouting the war cry, okay? Israel and the Philistines were drawing up in that valley, facing off on each other. They were posturing for battle, but all they were doing was a bunch of shouting, okay? They were just a bunch of posers, okay? They were posturing for a fight, but the fight never seemed to kind of come. You know, it was never coming. And so having just shown up, David checks in with his brothers. So David left all that stuff Dad told him to bring with the keeper of the supplies, and he ran to the battle lines, and he asked his brothers, how's it going? How are you doing? Okay? And as he was talking to them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance. And David heard it. And for the first time, for David now, it starts to sink into him of what's really going on in this situation, okay? And David starts asking some questions to make sure he's clear on what's going on. And so David asked the men that were standing nearby, you know, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? And we're about to see that David feels how David feels about what he's hearing and seeing. David says this. First he calls this guy this disgrace. And then he says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that should defy the armies of the living God? Don't miss the fact that with this statement, in what he says next, David is implying that he will face Goliath. Verse 27 says, they repeated to him what they've been saying and told him, this is what will be done for the man who kills him. And there's going to be great things that are going to happen for this guy. And the details of this story read so much but like real life, okay? Stuff like this actually happens all the time. Enter in some dysfunctional family dynamics, okay, dealing with birth order, okay? Verse 28, when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard his little brother speaking with the men, and he specifically heard, what he heard was the implication that the whole army was failing miserably, okay, in the face of this challenge, in David's opinion, okay? And he burned with anger. So Eliab got really mad at his little brother for the questions that he was asking and the kind of judgment that he was pouring on everybody. He says, why do you come down here? And with whom do you leave who did you leave the little sheep with? Okay, you know, don't you go back out and protect those sheep, little brother? I know how conceited you are. You know, I know how wicked your heart is. You only came down to watch the battle, right? And David's reply was, what have I done? What have I done? Can I even say something? Can I even speak? And then David turned away to someone else and brought the matter up again. And the men answered him as before. And David approached group after group of soldiers, and he was implying that he would do what they were afraid to do. And so what David, and it says in verse 31, what David said was overheard, and it was repeated to the king, to King Saul, and Saul sent for him. And now, next, David explicitly says what he'd been implying. David said to the king, he said, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant, me, will go and fight him. But Saul didn't think David could do it. So Saul says, you're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, okay? He's been a warrior from his youth. You're not able. Okay, you can't stand up against this giant. You alone? I mean, are you kidding me? You know, you can't defeat your giant. Sound familiar? When you think about your giant, sometimes that's how you feel, right? And maybe there's people around you that say those things to you when you consider it. But David was made out of different kind of stuff. So David said to Saul, hey, listen, I've been keeping my father's sheep, okay, for a long time. And when a lion or a bear came, okay, and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it. I killed it. I struck it. I rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it, okay? He says, your servant, me, I've killed both lion and bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he has defied. Notice he doesn't say the armies of Israel. He says he's defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. So David presents his qualifications, and he's careful to point out that he gives God the credit. He says it was the Lord who gave me the ability to defeat those wild animals. Anything that I've accomplished has been through his strength, through his hand. He had faith that the Lord who rescued him from those dangers would do it again. And note the contrast throughout this whole story of faith versus unbelief. The soldiers' words were all of resignation and self-defeat. David's words weren't of resignation, they were of indignation. Okay? The men of Israel called Goliath, this man, there he is, there's that guy. Okay? David calls him this uncircumcised Philistine. Who is this guy to defy the armies of the living God? They said that Goliath defied Israel. David said he defied the armies of the living God. They referred the people that were living in unbelief referred to. They referred to a potential victor as the man who kills him. David refers to him as the man who removes this disgrace from Israel. In other words, the men of Israel see an all-powerful, fearsome giant. And David sees an unbelieving Philistine who has the audacity to reproach the living God. David sees the all-powerful, fearsome God standing before this seeming insurmountable obstacle. And David remembered what everyone, including King Saul, had forgot, that the God of Israel was supreme. Perhaps David even remembered that the God of Israel had already kicked the God of the Philistines' rear end, years before. And it's vividly portrayed. It's recorded for us in 1 Samuel chapter 5. This is such an amazing story. The God of Israel roughs up the God of the Philistines. It says this in chapter 5 of 1 Samuel. Now the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it before Ebenezer to Ashdod. And when the Philistines took the ark of God, which was the embodiment of the presence of God, and brought it to the house of Dagon. So the Philistines had captured this thing where God's power kind of resided in a special way, and they brought it into the place of their God, Dagon. And they left it there. They went to bed, And it says in verse 3, when the Ashdodites rose early the next morning, it says, behold, Dagon, their god, had fallen on his face, because he was just like a statue, fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. And so they took Dagon and set him back up again. What's our God doing? And then they went to bed again the next night and left the thing in there. The next morning, Dagon had fallen on his face before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both palms of his hands were cut off, and only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. And neither the priests of Dagon nor all who entered Dagon's house, it said that they ended up not treading on the threshold of Dagon to this day, that they had to memorialize the fact that the God of Israel had kicked the butt of the God of the Philistines, this God Dagon. Yahweh, which was the name of the Israelites' God, had roughed up their God. And it was a rough couple of nights for the God of the Philistines. And it was kind of embarrassing, when your God needs to be kind of stood up again and stuff. And then what happened was the God of the Israelites went out and kind of roughed up all of the people, put tumors all over them and sores and stuff. And finally they had to just let them go and stuff because, so David maybe remembered all this stuff, and he wanted to go out there and fight Goliath, because he believed that the God of Israel was the supreme God, and that the Philistines worshipped a false God, and that he would bring his God into battle with him and defeat this enemy, this giant, this insurmountable obstacle. So Saul said to David, go ahead. The king said, go ahead, David, go out. The Lord be with you. And then Saul dressed David in his own coat and stuff, and he put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. And David he tried to put the sword around him and tried to use all this stuff. And finally David said, you know what, I got all this stuff on me and stuff, and I don't know how to use any of this stuff, and it's kind of heavy and stuff. I can't go with this because I'm not used to fighting this way. And so he went with the way he was used to fighting, because he was believing that God was going to be in the battle with him. And he said this. He then took his staff in his hand, okay, with the shepherd's staff, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the stream. The 5 smooth stones is kind of interesting, because what I believe is we find out in the story that Goliath also had 4 brothers, okay? And so he was going to go out there and take down Goliath with one of those stones, but he also maybe had 4 stones left over in case the brothers started coming out and getting them too, okay? And so he took those 5 smooth stones, put them in his pouch of his shepherd's bag, and he took his slingshot with him, okay? And it was kind of like one of these kinds of slingshots, and he approached the Philistine. You see, for David, it was not about the quality of his weapons. It was about the quality of his Lord, of his God. And the Philistine saw this, and meanwhile it says the Philistine with his shield bearer, his caddy, okay, was in front of him, kept coming closer to David. And he looked at David over, and he saw that he was just this young guy and glowing with health, it says, and handsome. And it just made the Philistine just despise him all the more. And he said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? He's talking about David's physical appearance. You little stick? Are you going to come and try to attack me? And the Philistine cursed David by the names of his gods. You know, the ones that Yahweh had already taken care of the years before. And he said, come here. Come here, little boy, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and to the wild animals. And David said to the Philistine, you know, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, that you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down, and I'm going to cut off your head, big man. That's just what's going to happen. And I'm going to get this very day, I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God who's all-powerful in Israel. And all those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves. The battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. It's not the quality of our weapons. It's the quality of our God. And as the Philistine moved closer, really upset now, getting ready to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag, he took out a stone, he slung it, it struck the Philistine on the head, and I love this line, the stone sank, it says, into his forehead. Just went in there. And the Philistine went boom, and he fell down on the ground. And David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, without a sword in his hand. He struck down the Philistine and he killed him. And then David ran over and stood over him, I imagine before he got up, right? And he ran toward the opportunity to finish this. And he took hold of his sword and he drew it from the sheath, and he killed him and cut off his head with the sword. Giants go down when we make it the Lord's battle instead of our battle. The Philistines all saw, they were blown away what happened, and their hero was dead, and they started turning and running. And then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward, now empowered and feeling the courage that the situation had unleashed on them, and with a shout they pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the road to Gath and Ekron. Something I didn't tell you from the 1 Samuel 5 account is that one of the places specifically mentioned where the armies of Israel had gone before was to Gath, after Yahweh had taken down their God. And when the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. And David took the Philistine's head and he brought it with him to Jerusalem just to go show his dad and show everybody that he had defeated this giant. And he put the Philistines' weapons as trophies in his own tent. And Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine and said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is that? Who is that young guy? Who is that guy? And he said, I don't know. And he said, well, go find out whose son he is. And as soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul. And with David still holding, he's just walking around with this thing, still holding the Philistine's head. He says, "Whose son are you?" Saul asked him. He said, "I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem. I am the one that took out the king, the help of the God that I believe in, the Almighty One." Now here's the point. Here's the point of this whole story. His greatest hit from the early years. Just like David, look, you can face your giant, and I can face my giants. And you can face your giant even if you aren't the smartest, even if you aren't the strongest, even if you aren't the best equipped, okay, or the holiest. David was flawed, just like you and me. And for those of us who face giants, you know, the giants, the ones that get in our heads, you know, and create that can't-do attitude, David gives us this reminder, okay? Focus on the giants, and you're going to stumble, okay? But focus on God, and your giants will tumble, okay? God can take care of you. He wants to take care of you. And this story is meant to inspire us to go after those insurmountable obstacles and to rely on God to help us. The same God who helped him is available and wants to help us as we face the stuff that we're afraid of, the stuff that seems like insurmountable. And you know, everybody was afraid of this giant. Because why? Because giants are big. Giants are scary. And so what everybody did in the story, except for David, was they felt defeated. They would run away. They would shout at it. They would worry about it and stuff. They would talk about it, but they didn't deal with it. And David says, listen, you can run towards that challenge. With God on your side, you can run towards us. You can rush your giants. And you can download some of heaven's, you know, resolve and that unsquashable courage. And you can say, whatever it is, that great fear that you have, that problem, that situation that you're facing, you're saying, you know what, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen anymore. That giant of addiction, that giant of bigotry, you're going down, okay? That giant of child abuse, that giant of insecurity, that giant of you know, fear. I'm going to live different. Jesus says to you and me, he says, I'm bigger than whatever that giant is that you're facing. I'm bigger than your problems. I'm bigger than your failures. I'm bigger than your regrets. I can overcome your faults. And I'm bigger than that guilt and that sin that you're facing. If you let me, if you open the door, if you let me in and open my resources, avail yourself of what I have for you, I will come in and I will be your forgiver. I will be the one who will strengthen you. I will be your friend. I will be the one that will speak courage into your mind and your soul. You see, it's on the cross that we saw that God is bigger than anything at all. Our sin, our guilt, our regret. And it's in that empty tomb that we see that the one that came forth, the one who defeated death and overcame it. God knows about the Goliaths in our lives. He really does. He knows about our worries. He knows about our fears. He knows about what's going on with your kids, maybe, that thing that you're worrying about with them. He knows what you've lost. He knows about maybe that divorce that's wrecked you and made you feel insecure and maybe worthless. He knows about that crumbling marriage. He knows about everything that's going on in our lives. He knows about the fears that we're all living with. And he knows where your dreams have died. But he also is the one that can bring and build better dreams into your life and your future. If you just ask him, his presence is bigger. He can become bigger in your life than you've ever known. And he'd give you the courage to go forward and to live a prevailing life. 2021 is upon us. And 2021 can be a really good year. Even if things just keep going bad, generally in the world, it doesn't mean that it has to be that way for you and for me. because our God is bigger than any trouble we face in this world. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you for the promise, this simple promise that the Apostle Paul reminded us of because of the resurrected Christ and the power that we can avail ourselves of, and because of your Spirit who comes alongside us and indwells us and empowers us. He said this, and we can confess this too. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Lord, make that reality true for each one of us in this new year. For it's in your holy, powerful name that we pray. Amen. Hey, Happy New Year! It's 2021. We threw out the old one. Aren't you glad? I know I am. And I just hope and pray that this new year just becomes just an amazing time for you, and that you experience just an upwelling of strength and courage as you tackle whatever giants, whatever fears, whatever those things are in your life. And we want you to know that we want to help you in any ways that we can to do that. You can contact us through rcvc.life. If you need a kick in the pants, just a word of encouragement, if you'd like us to come alongside you and just pray for whatever's going on in your life, we'd love to do that, and we'd love to be there for you and encourage you in this new year. And thank you for the ways that you've supported us this past year financially to keep our lights on and to keep all these the stuff, the activities that we do are able to still do. And we just want to encourage you and thank you for the gifts that we'll be provided with in 2021. God bless you and have a great year.
Again, I need you, Lord, I need you. Walking down this desert road, water for my thirsty soul. I need you, Lord, I need you. Your forgiveness is like sweet, sweet honey on my lips. It's like the sound of symphony to my ears. It's like holy water on my skin. Yes, Lord. Dead man walking, slave to sin. I want to know about being born again. I need you. Oh God, I need you. So take me to the riverside, take me on and baptize. I need you. Oh God, I need you. Your forgiveness is like sweet, sweet honey on my lips. It's like the sound of symphony to my ears. It's like holy water on my skin. Yes, Lord. I don't wanna abuse your grace. God, I need it every day. It's the only thing that ever really makes me wanna change. I don't wanna abuse your grace. God, I need it every day. It's the only thing that ever really makes me wanna change. I don't wanna abuse your grace. God, I need it every day. It's the only thing that ever really makes me wanna change. I don't wanna abuse your grace. God, I need it every day. It's the only thing that ever really makes me wanna change. Your forgiveness is like sweet, sweet honey
is like the sound of symphony to my ears. It's like holy water. Your forgiveness is like sweet, sweet